Today I'm going to talk about trigger stacking. For those of you who don't know what trigger stacking is, it's applicable to more than just horses. Humans and other animals also experience trigger stacking. Trigger stacking refers to when a bunch of things that bother an animal at varying degrees. Not all the things have to bother the creature the same amount. All of these things eventually stack up over time and they fill a cup. So the threshold of tolerance is like a cup. And triggers stack up and they fill the cup in layers. If the animal isn't able to relieve the stress from the triggers in enough time, they can get to the top of the cup, and then that's when they're over threshold. And when the triggers stack and take them above threshold, that's when you experience flight behaviors, and also behaviors where the horse might have a reaction that seems enormous compared to what they're reacting to. So, for example, if a horse has filled their cup in the barn from stressors of the barn, being spooked in the stall, being stressed about not being able to get out of the stall, being lonely without friends. They walk past the arena and a flag touches them, the cup fills up more. A loud noise happens when they're in the show ring, fills up more. Finally, the last straw is an especially spooky jump. The rider hits them with the crop, and then you get a response like this where they rear up. And the horse could be a very good show jumping horse. It can be a horse that's usually very dependable. It doesn't matter. If it's hit above threshold, you'll get a behavior that might seem over the top for what they're reacting to. And what this means is that the animal could react to something that they typically would ignore and that they'd typically be able to tune out because they're in a calmer state. These flight behaviors from the horse that don't always match what they're reacting to are no different than when you stub your toe after an especially bad week, month, or year, and things have just piled on top of one after the other, and from stubbing your toe, you just break down and you throw an entire temper tantrum. You're crying, you're howling, you're cursing, you're mad, and you're taking it well above what seems reasonable for the event that finally took you over threshold. But the thing is, you're not just reacting to stubbing your toe or whatever that last straw was. You're reacting to all of the things that have stacked up in that cup over time, and then finally you're at your wit's end and you have that meltdown where you need to release all this negative energy that has been building up. And this is why sometimes horses will react out of nowhere. They're quite subtle when they are stressed, so their stress behaviors aren't as likely to be heard by people. And what this means is that they can go over threshold and have all these triggers stack and then appear to react out of nowhere. And then people will in turn get more angry with them because they'll be like, this happened out of nowhere and there was no warning signs. But the problem is that the warning signs were just small enough that the person was able to tune them out. And then when the horse eventually does get over threshold, you get a big reaction that you're not necessarily prepared for if you haven't been paying attention and watching the horse get near to the threshold. So keep triggers in mind, because if you bring your horse out on a cold and windy day and a branch snaps, they're more likely to be taken over threshold quicker. And this can happen in a variety of scenarios. Showing is a great example because it's more stressful. So that's that. So what can you do to help avoid these triggers stacking and having the cup overflow? First and foremost, learning your horse's normal behavior and where they're typically at is very important. Be mindful of how their face looks. If they have any tightness above the eye, when they're really stressed, you can usually see a peak above the eye where there's more wrinkles above the eyelid. When they're stressed, they'll also clench their teeth more and the chewing muscles along their jaw will be more prominent. You'll see the mouth hold tension and the nostrils will also hold tension. And also how they hold their ears will help determine whether or not they're stressed or in pain. Watching the eyes and seeing if they're holding more tension than usual or if you can see any white and they don't typically show sclera. Some horses do naturally show some of the white of their eyes, so there is a difference. So learning about what your horse's normal resting state is important. Once you're mindful of what they regularly look like on a relaxed, normal, calm day, then you can start to notice when their energy level starts to get up. So if you bring your horse out, they've had a couple days off, it's a crisp day, you can expect that they're going to be more agitated by things that might not typically bother them on a hotter day where they have had more to do prior to being brought out. And with this in mind, you can do stuff to help de-escalate the behavior before they get above threshold. And to do this, you can do stuff like if you notice your horse starting to get nervous through transitions and they're having a hard time staying consistent at the trot, they're holding tension, they might be jigging, you can try to do something that you know helps them relieve tension. For a lot of horses, bringing it right back to groundwork and doing some walking exercises, groundwork, teaching them how to go on obstacles and basically just changing direction a lot and redirecting the behaviors, but in a low energy way that keeps the energy level down, but still keeps their brain busy so they can't focus on what's going on around them. Also, rewarding the calm behaviors that you want to see and heavily reinforcing calming behaviors are important for helping reduce the energy level and keeping them below threshold. Sometimes, because we cannot completely control the environment, we will have horses get above threshold, and that's fine. But the point is that in training, you shouldn't intentionally be trying to get that stress response where you're pushing and pushing and pushing and causing them to go above threshold with intent. Sometimes you won't notice where a horse is at in their cup, and the cup might even only be half full or a third full, but then something really, really big and scary can happen and suddenly they're above threshold and you get a big reaction. Mistake-free training is not possible because we're not perfect, but you should try to get as close to it as possible, and by being mindful of your horse's stress, you're going to be more considerate of it. Stress isn't completely avoidable in life for us or for horses, but there's not a reason to intentionally elicit stress, get that stress response when the horse is above threshold, and then punish them for it when you as the trainer caused it to happen. Keep yourself safe, and if you're working with a horse who easily goes above threshold and is dangerous, use a barrier system to keep yourself a little bit safer so that you're not in the position where you're immediately in danger. And if you are immediately in danger, do what you have to do to get out of it, but then take that information with you for next time so that you don't make the same mistake and that you do better by your horse next time. It's really that easy, and it'll keep you and your horse so much safer. I reiterate, the purpose of this video isn't trying to shame people if they've ever made a horse spook, because we all have. We can all kind of rush things or get greedy at times or push it a little further and make the mistake of doing too much and having a response that we weren't looking for. But when you get conscious of what you're looking for and conscious of watching to see your animal if they get more anxious or if they're nearing the top of their threshold, then that means you can work to de-escalate and bring that energy level down. I also think that knowing this information is really important for people because people also experience trigger stacking. And all of us have experienced times in our life where we've been really overwhelmed and stressed by stuff going on outside of our lives that we might not really be talking to friends and family about. And then you can have this minor inconvenience happen and you explode and you have a huge temper tantrum and it's so over the top and it seems so out of character and not really matching up with what you're reacting to. We've all experienced this type of meltdown when we're struggling with life, and that's because of going over threshold and being outside of our window of tolerance and no longer able to cope with little inconveniences and things that we would typically just let roll off our shoulders like water off of a duck's back. So I think understanding trigger stacking and putting a name to it and explaining how it works is also good for teaching people how to be more compassionate towards each other. Because if someone snaps at you one day who typically doesn't, you could take it really personally, and it's often hard not to. But if you know the person well and you know that they've been dealing with hard things, or you can suspect that they have been, it gives you a little bit of a reason to understand, okay, this might explain why they're reacting this way. And it works for your horse too. Instead of taking things personally when your horse reacts or blaming yourself for being a bad rider or saying that you're not good enough or that you're too bad for your horse or your horse isn't good enough for you or that you'll never get better and just self-deprecating and looking at the negatives. Instead of doing that, you can look at it and go, okay, I missed something. My horse's reaction doesn't always have to do exactly with me, and it's not always me making a blatant mistake or being a bad rider. It can just be me missing information that the horse is giving me, which doesn't make you a bad horse person. It is very easy to miss information with animals that actively try to hide when they are stressed. For horses, it's advantageous to hide how they're actually feeling because if they're very clearly stressed or compromised or in pain, it makes them a target for predators. So their behaviors are usually quite subtle until they actually have this big flight response. This horse here is showing you some stress signs with the clenching of the jaw muscles. You can see that the chewing muscles are more tense. The eye is tense, and while this horse does appear like he would have some natural sclera, the peak of the eye indicates stress. I love this infographic. It's a great one for training your eye. So the left eye right here is the one with the peak above the eye, and that indicates stress or pain. The softness of the eye in the second photo is a relaxed eye. Learning what your horse looks at resting is important because you can train your eye for your specific horse. Training your eye can be hard, so what I recommend is looking at these types of comparisons often because it can teach you to notice it at earlier stages. Because the horse in this left stage, when the eye is that wrinkled, that indicates a fair amount of stress. They'll start kind of showing a peak above their eye when they're moderately stressed, and it's not always like they're about to have a meltdown. So the more you can train your eye, the more likely you are able to be able to tell when they're upset, even in instances where they're not extremely stressed. So this is a good infographic of pain face. Number 1 indicates that the ears are turned out to the side and they're wider through the base than they are at the top. And when they're like this, they stay like this for a while, and it's not due to the horse resting. When a horse is in a resting state and the rest of their face is relaxed, it doesn't matter if their ears look like that. So you want to look at the full picture. And then number 2, of course, is the peak above the eye, as I mentioned. 3 is the nostrils tightening and how they look when they're stressed. They change shape. 4 is the tightness of the chewing muscles. And then 5 is the tightness of the muzzle itself. This is another excellent photo of the peak above the eye of a stressed eye. And another thing that I just want to remind you guys of is to be easy on yourselves. A lot of trainers aren't teaching their students properly, and a lot of us are taught misconceptions growing up that we then take with us into our adult lives as horse people and never are taught to question because it's so normalized. We're taught to tune out and ignore a lot of behaviors that are actually indicators of stress. And we're also taught to normalize flight responses to such an extent that people view it as largely unavoidable, when in a lot of cases, if you started de-escalating the stress level earlier, you could have avoided at least having as large of a stress experience. Or you could prepare the horse better for the next time and avoid that from happening again. But the problem is people largely feel helpless because they're not taught the nuances of horse behavior in training, which means when something happens that they don't know how to handle, there's kind of this panic moment, and a lot of the stuff that we teach people for immediate fixes isn't actually getting to the bottom of the problem, it's just masking it. And by being taught to mask it, I mean a lot of factors in the horse world. So this horse in the photo here, I got this photo off of Dover. You can see that he has the peak above his eye and a stress face. He's wearing draw reins, which serve to manufacture a position by using a pulley system and pulling the horse's head down. Whether or not you use these properly, the problem with draw reins is that since it's a pulley system, the rider can't really feel whether or not the horse starts to get heavy or tired, and it's forcing the horse to maintain a position that you don't know if they're actually physically ready for or flexible enough for. So what this means is that it's basically like almost forcing, like if you were just to force someone to do the splits or do a stretch that they weren't ready for, and they couldn't tell you when they were uncomfortable and they couldn't vocalize it loudly enough for you to hear, you would be hurting them without realizing it. And this is the problem with a lot of things like draw reins and a lot of the methods that we use and suggest to people, because they serve the purpose of trying to make a shortcut. And then it ignores what the horse is trying to tell us, and it serves to gag them and mask behaviors that they try to tell us. Say, hey, I'm bothered by this. And again, this isn't about shaming or guilt tripping people if you use draw reins. It's about talking about how they work and cautioning you on how much you use them or the manner in which you use them, because at the end of the day, unless you can like psychically communicate with your horse silently, you don't know when they're no longer comfortable with this. And the problem with draw reins is that the rider holds all the control. So even if in theory a horse on their own would carry themselves in a similar way to when they're wearing draw reins, the very important distinction is the choice behind it. And the same applies to people. A human might like doing certain things if they have a choice and there's autonomy involved. For example, this is kind of a weird one to give, but it's the first one that I thought of. It would be like the difference between being hogtied and held hostage and having your partner tie you up if that's what you're into for bondage or something. There's autonomy involved in one and consent involved in one, but not in the other. So just because someone might like it in one instance doesn't mean they like it in the other. And this goes for a lot of things related to horses. Consent and autonomy and the ability to make decisions within their environment and have an understanding of what the meaning of that decision is and what it brings them is important. So what this means is if a horse makes a decision consistently that never has the same answer, they learn that they really have no control over their environment, and it's an unhealthy welfare place to be in. And this doesn't mean that they always need to have complete control. You can give perceived control in a lot of ways and bring the horse in the direction that you want to head in anyways, and make it rewarding for them and the best choice for them. But the goal is to not remove choice and basically make it coercive. Because as soon as you start using restrictive devices that serve to hold the horse consistently in a singular position for a lengthy amount of time, you're taking away that consent and that autonomy, which is where you start to have these stress behaviors and negative welfare state develop. Because the horse can't tell you, hey, I'm getting kind of sore here. I'd like to stretch my neck out and poke my nose out a little bit. And if they're in draw reins, you don't feel it. But if they're not in draw reins and they're just learning how contact works, they can stick their nose out a little bit and they can stretch or they can adjust their frame to get more comfortable. Much like we would adjust our postures and whatnot in school. Can you imagine if in school you just got strapped to your desk all day and you weren't allowed to even adjust at all? And for some people, this might have actually happened, and I'm sure you would say, yes, it was horrible. But basically, this is what we serve to do with horses and how we handle some of their training. So I wanted to talk about these restrictive devices in terms of talking about trigger stacking, because using stuff like this adds in a stressor, especially if they're used for lengthy periods of time and in stressful situations, because they make the horse feel more trapped and constricted. So this in itself is a stressor. So depending on what equipment you use, you could be starting with your threshold cup filled like a third to half or more, and you could increase it depending on what you choose to ride in on any given day. For example, if your saddle doesn't fit, then that's one thing added in the cup that the horse is going to be stressed about. Add in a harsh bit, there you go again. And the problem is harsh bits and equipment that serves to shortcut and kind of force the horse into certain positions are very common in the horse world. This little number right here is one of my most hated training pieces of equipment, the rein right. It's essentially just a bungee that you clip to the bit and then under the girth, so it pulls the horse's mouth down, but since it's a bungee, it'll pull and release, pull and release. But it really just pulls the bit right down into their tongue, and I don't love that at all. They say it helps with carriage and whatnot, but carriage comes from the back and the hind end and the core as the engine, so pulling their head down and restricting them in that way doesn't make sense. And it's also being marketed as something that's safe to jump in and also use on racehorses, and I think it's just a danger. It's asking for a leg to be hung up in it. But it serves the same purpose as draw reins in that it serves the purpose of trying to pull the horse's head down and manufacture a position faster. So it does the same thing where the rider could very well have no idea what the horse's comfort level is, if their neck is starting to cramp or seize, if they're being overbent or pushed into a position that's physically uncomfortable, if they need a break from it. And the problem is a lot of these training aids are used for the whole ride or a decent part of it. So it removes that autonomy and then it creates this stressor because you're pushing them into a position that could be uncomfortable and stressful for them to maintain. And as that pain continues to increase or that discomfort increases and they add more outside triggers that might be unrelated to their equipment, that's where you can manufacture a larger stress response by gagging your horse and making them uncomfortable in training, and then you're more likely to get these outbursts. So what can you do to get calmness in horses? First and foremost, you want to be someone that your horse is comfortable approaching and being around. If they have to worry about being punished for how they react to things or be afraid of how you are going to react to their fear when they spook, then it makes you an unsafe person to be around and they're unlikely to let go as much tension in your presence. So you want to be a safe person to be around that offers them comfort and support and can show them that they're not going to get harmed in your care. And getting this often involves us checking ourselves and slowing down our ego and not being pushed around as much by what our goals are and what the goals of people around us are and what we feel pressured to do based off of that. So slowing it right down and learning how to be friends with your horse and communicate with your horse and teach them that you listen to them is how you get to that point. And the more you do this, the really cool thing about it is the more you actually work to communicate and listen to your horse, the more they communicate with you. Once they realize that you're listening and that when they communicate with you, it's heard and it changes something or that you're making an effort to understand, they start offering more and more behaviors to communicate with you. And then you develop this way cooler relationship with them as a result. And it's really, really special and cool. So there's not really a downside. Anyways, I haven't posted about him on YouTube yet, but that little pinto pony right there sleeping in this photo, he is my newest auction rescue pony. I've not had a lot of time to work with him, but he arrived like Simon, completely feral, although he was naturally more brave and confident in himself than Simon, which was great, so he was a lot more curious and willing to investigate. But as you can see here in this photo, he's laying flat out, fast asleep with Banksy, and I got to approach him and come near him. I've not had him for that long and I haven't had a lot of time to work with him, so largely he's just been left to his own devices and allowed to coexist with my horses and approach people of his own accord if he so chooses. And being that he is so naturally curious, he did just do that a lot. And so he's essentially tamed himself all without ever being haltered yet. And I can scratch him all over. I can scratch his ears. I can touch his face. He let me sit on the ground with him while he was resting. All of these things taught without any force or pressure yet at all. And just by rewarding him for the approach and coming up to me and showing him that he could follow me around and investigate me from afar and just watch me or even come closer and I wasn't going to hurt him. And this allowed us to develop a friendship very, very quickly, even when initially he started off defensive. Because he would approach people with curiosity and he'd want to touch you, but if you tried to reach out and touch him, then he'd kind of do the alligator mouth and it's a warning. It's not that he's actually going to attack someone, so I would never ever smack or discipline a horse for this because that is a terrible idea. But when he did that, it's like, okay, time to back off, walk away, follows me again, and he's like, oh, cool. I don't have to warn her anymore because she's going to respect my boundaries. And anyways, I wanted to bring him up, one, to introduce him on here because I haven't yet. I'll make a video about him once I have more time. Things have been really hectic, guys. But two, to say that you don't need to pressure and force your horse into a relationship with you, that it really does work to use these different methods. And honestly, initially, I took a lot of shortcuts too, and I used to use stuff like draw reins and stuff back in the day and do some really terrible things to horses and have a lot of bad treatment of horses normalized to me from my initial mentors and trainers. And it has taken a very long time to sway away from that and kind of relearn a different way, especially since our society and culture is so punishment-based. People and humans love to punish each other. We love to make and humiliate each other. We love to hold each other accountable. We love to dominate each other and have status and basically try to be better than everyone else. And we project this on how we handle animals and how animals treat us. We assume that it's malice and that they're intentionally doing something to bother us when something goes wrong, because that's how we view stuff in our own society. And since our society is so punishment based, it normalizes this type of treatment and normalizes laying blame, placing fault, and reacting to stuff in a punishment based way. So breaking free from that is very hard, and it can be so hard to undo those old biases, but it all starts with some curiosity and interest in looking into different ways and then slowly learning more. And you don't have to completely copy them and take them all right away and do it all right away all at once. But you can gradually alter your training by experimenting and trying new things, seeing what works and learning more, and then adjusting your practices accordingly. No one is perfect or flaw-free, so it's not always going to go seamlessly, and that's okay. There's going to be bumps in the road. And also, it can be really hard to undo old habits, so don't try to beat yourself up too much, because if you're trying, you're doing a lot better than a lot of other people out there who don't try at all. So don't be embarrassed if you make mistakes or if you're not sure of like where exactly your direction is yet. Just try doing new things to like lessen the stress your horse experiences and make their life easier. To avoid trigger stacking as fastly, I think one of the most important things riders need to do is make sure their horse's management is decent. And obviously in some areas this is more difficult than others. But by decent management, I mean that horses are animals that are first of all incredibly social, so contact with other horses is very important. Even if it's just over a fence or between the bars of a stall, that's better than nothing, but ideally they should have a buddy that they get to go out with and turn out. They also need constant access to forage, so they either need to have hay in front of them basically all the time or have access to grass. They're trickle-feeding animals, which means they're meant to consume small amounts of grass or hay all the time, basically. Most of their time budget daily is spent eating. And when they're not able to do this, then they develop too much stomach acid and get gastric issues like ulcers, which result in discomfort and pain, and also can have behavioral issues come out of that. So having frequent access to hay is also very important. Another important aspect of horse care is freedom. And this is something that's also commonly forgotten because of the prevalence of stalling and also the use of very small paddocks. I understand in city lives it might be harder to do this, but even if you can't get the perfect ideal, if you know that it's not perfect, then that's where you go, okay, what forms of enrichment can I get to make this better? But anyways, for freedom, they should have space to kind of self-exercise and play in turnout. So ideally walk, trot, canter, enough space to run around, and like I said, with a buddy in a perfect situation. If they can't have this, you can improve it for them by offering them toys like lick-it treats, hay balls, lick mats that you can drill into the walls, then put like honey or molasses on, and then they can lick them off. If they'll play with like ball toys like jolly balls, you can get those. You can get treat balls that they can roll around that dispense treats, and you can also set things like different slow feeder hay nets and slow feeder boxes in different areas of their paddock or stall so that they can walk around and kind of simulate grazing. And also making sure the diet is predominantly forage-based with as little grain as possible is important. Lots of people overgrain their horses thinking that their horses are hard keepers and need it, but a lot of us mess up our horses' metabolisms by feeding too much grain and too little hay or not enough quality hay. And then they need grain to keep weight on because it's what they're used to. But if you slowly wean them off onto a better diet, it is very successful. I've done it with a lot of my thoroughbreds off the track. And by a lot of my thoroughbreds, I mean all of them. I don't feed very much grain at all, and it has resulted in their stomach health being so much better. And I also don't have issues with colic and whatnot to anywhere near the same extent as what I used to when I was in a traditional barn where my horse was in a stall overnight and then a small paddock during the day with set hay feedings. We had so many colics at that barn, man. And studies support this. So I'm just sharing my anecdotal experience along with saying that they've done a lot of studies and there's a very strong correlation with time spent stalled and without enough forage and horses who have a higher colic risk. This is Harlow again comparing the difference in her condition without being on lots of grain. And she was a harder keeper when I got her. And again, she basically is only on a hay diet right now. She gets a very small amount of grain and she's a chunky girl right now. But she started out being fed a ton of hay and was a hard keeper at the racetrack. Being off less grain and more hay and also being treated for ulcers has done a huge overhaul on her personality. It helped her quiet down a lot. It helped her put on more weight and keep it on, and it made her more comfortable physically. She went from being a horse who'd be pinning her ears and biting at people for brushing to one that likes being brushed and groomed all over and actually enjoys being scratched. She went from being a horse who was incredibly anxious and explosive to a horse that I can really depend on to take places and get out on experiences, and she keeps it together and she's good with traffic and she can cope with her stress a lot better. But the key was first changing her management and then second being mindful of where she was at in her threshold and watching the cup. And when I started to see her behavior going up, that's when I would have to do things that would bring it down. To start that with her, I taught her some default calming behaviors inside of her turnout pen where she was most comfortable and happy that I then started to use the more I started to slowly bring her out of her comfort zone. So what this meant is that these behaviors were closely linked to the feeling of being calm and safe. And they were easy to do so that when I took her out of that calm and safe zone and she started to get the threshold up, I could ask her to do one of these calming check-in type behaviors and then reward her for it. And it would help bring that threshold down so that her cup wouldn't overflow. And the check-in behavior could be as simple as just getting her to halt and then turn her eye towards me, and then I click and reward that. Because that stops her for a second and stops her from escalating her behaviors and teaches herself to kind of bring herself back, self-soothe, and then carry on. One last comparison of the eye. The left photo is Harlow at the racetrack, and as you can see, her eye is insane. This is my favorite comparison of the stressed eye versus the calm eye. The interesting thing is in the left photo, this would have been her home, in theory, where she should have been the most comfortable because it's where she spent the most of her time. The right photo was actually my first time taking her off property after she'd had like 2 or 3 weeks off, and look at how much calmer her face is. So this is what happens when you take these stressors into account and really work on limiting how high their stress threshold gets. They get calmer. So yeah, by being mindful of some of these things, you can make your relationship with your horse so much better, and you can also make it a lot more fun to work with them because they won't have the same level of stress, and you can avoid a lot of the problem behaviors that you might be seeing. Through being mindful of this, you can also teach them to deal with things that you would have thought impossible. For example, if your horse cannot be clipped without sedation, if you work slowly enough and keep them under that threshold and teach them that they don't need to fear clippers, you won't always need sedation to clip them. Same goes for stuff like trailering. It's all possible to reduce that stress response. It just becomes more work and more time consuming to do it the more time the horse has had to build a negative association with whatever they're afraid of. And also, if you use predominantly punishment-based methods and try to teach them to mask their fear behaviors, it makes it more difficult because they're never actually able to experience fear, which helps their nervous system relieve some of that nervous energy. So all these behaviors serve a purpose, and when we mask them, it creates problems, even in ourselves. So this applies to people too. When you mask behaviors that help you relieve stress, it makes you stuck. But I hope that this was a good explanation for people, and I wanted to do the photos in the background, which is why I filmed this on TikTok, because that was the easiest way that I knew how to do it. And I hope that that helped, because I think that getting an idea and an eye for behavior will help people a lot in identifying things before they spiral out of control and get more dangerous. So I hope that this was useful, and I appreciate all you again for supporting my channel and my pages. And for those of you who are interested, I have a small business and we sell really cute Christmas stuff and also just horse-related stuff in general. And we're also having a big restocking on my bridles that I sell, that I created. They're anatomical, no crank noseband, no drop noseband, padded monocrown, nice, soft, easy. I was frustrated with how many flash nosebands and drop nosebands and crank nosebands there were, so I took matters into my own hands. This is one of the bitless bridles. It's just a little side pull, so really nice and soft, no cross under action, immediate release if you release your contact. Really nice and soft. These will be back in stock next week. And this is one of the bitted bridles. Similar design to the bitless, but of course with a bit. I made it for Harlow in specific because she had a lot of soreness in her poll when she came off the track, and it made her kind of toss her head and just not like it when she felt the bridle by her ears, and this bridle helped her a lot. And then there's also a sheepskin option in both styles. So I'll be announcing the date for these soon when we know the exact release date for the product restocking, but they're really cool and I just wanted to share them on here because I haven't really talked about them a ton on YouTube yet. And I tried to make them affordable so that people can get a nice quality bridle without spending an arm and a leg, because I know that a lot of the tack stores and stuff out there and the big bridal companies price gouge. So anyways, thank you for watching. Don't forget to check out the links down below and check out my store for some fun ideas for holiday shopping or just for treating yourself, or check out the bridles if you're interested. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. Thanks, guys.